Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented the 19th week of 2014 by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's the 6th of April, an anniversary of...
May.
Beg your pardon?
It's May. Sorry.
May. It is May.
Why don't we press on? Our program is about terrorism and what can be done to combat it. That's a serious matter and not a matter of not a laughing matter at all. It's hard for Americans to admit that by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is being run by the Obama administration, not by those we usually call terrorists. U.S. terrorism is not just Obama's drone strikes, which have killed not a few, but thousands of people, including 200 children. It's also the activities of the U.S. Special Operations Command, essentially the President's private army of some 70,000 members, who are active, according to their spokesman, in more than 130 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, which we call rendition, torture, and murder. Obama's global assassination program is only part of the policies pursued by this and earlier administrations that have plagued the world with war and destruction, not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who have gotten 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. That's the real source for U.S. support for Israel's crimes, which would be impossible without the military, economic, and diplomatic support of the U.S. The most important factor is that Israel is a stationary aircraft carrier for U.S. military control of the greatest energy-producing region of the world. Control, and not just access to energy resources, is what the U.S. has demanded for generations. Middle East gas and oil is the world's greatest material prize, said the U.S. State Department at the end of World War II. Control of gas and oil gives the U.S. indirect but politically critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that are also dependent on energy exports from the region, says Obama political advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. All U.S. administrations have been willing to kill a lot of people to secure that control, to use against our economic rivals. And all Israeli governments have been willing accomplices, as the world recognizes. Now Obama's project seems to be to seize Ukraine, through which Europe gets much of their energy resources from Russia. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, U.S. administrations, Republican and Democratic, have moved to establish U.S. economic and even military control over Eastern Europe, after promising not to extend its instrument of control, the NATO military alliance, into Eastern Europe. The Clinton and Bush administrations immediately broke that promise and extended NATO to the very borders of Russia. The Ukraine crisis grows out of an extension of that policy pursued by both Democratic and Republican administrations since the disappearance of the Soviet Union. In order to complete its plan, the U.S. has established the only government with officially anti-Semitic elements in it on the continent of Europe since the defeat of Nazism. That is, the government in Kiev, which the U.S. refers to as the government of Ukraine. Most Americans don't realize that Obama is carrying out this military and economic expansion in Europe, as well as conducting the most extreme campaign of terror in living memory, primarily, but not exclusively, in Asia and Africa, because the media downplay it and accept the Obama administration's flat lies that its war is winding down. Obama's job is to lie about what the U.S. government is doing around the world, but most particularly to American citizens. We'll talk about that tonight and make reference to the fact that a series of recent polls have shown Americans overwhelmingly opposed to the extension of Obama's wars. And that indeed is causing some dismay and distress in Washington and policymaking circles. Obama is being urged to up his game as far as killing people around the world by conventional American policy analysts. We'll talk about all these things tonight with help from commentaries from Karen Aram on Nigeria, Ron Zoke on secrecy and deception, Deb Johnson, the wagons are circling W, Stuart Levy, comment from an Aware demonstration, and Karen Evans-Levy, the Mother's Day proclamation. Our focus is on the war policy of the U.S. and what is being done in our name. And we'll start with Karen Aram on Nigeria.
Okay, before I mention Nigeria, I would like to comment on Condoleezza Rice bailing out of her talk at Rutgers University as a result of the students protesting a warmonger being paid $35,000 to speak at their university. And I really applaud the students for doing this, and I hope we will see more of it. We know that at New York City, is it New York City College? I'm not sure I'm saying that properly, that they did the same thing when Brennan went to speak there. So, but I see this as a very progressive move on the part of the student activist movement. But now I'm going to go to Nigeria. It's been dominating the media, petitions and postings on Facebook. Democracy Now! Discussed it this morning. And later I turned to CNN, and it seems to have replaced the Malaysian airliner crash. So I immediately become rather skeptical. Make no mistake, I'm horrified by the kidnapping of these Nigerian girls. I can't imagine I just can't imagine the pain and anguish that the parents are going through right now. But I also want to urge caution. I've seen this before too many times. In the early 2000s, I signed petitions regarding the ill treatment of women in Afghanistan before we attacked. We saw recently all of the concerns over the gassing of children in Syria, and as a reason for us to go in and bomb, which of course has now been proven. Research has shown that it was unlikely to have been the government that was being accused at the time, but more than likely it was some of the rebel groups, some of which we actually support. So when I see this, we see it many, many times in many, many places, but when I see this, I have to ask the question, okay, why are the petitions? Why is the news media, why is everyone calling out for us? They say we need to do something to help Nigeria. And my feeling is, yes, sign a petition to the Nigerian government urging them to take action, all right. But when the petition says we, and when they say support all efforts, I look at it from a legal standpoint and think, wait a minute, we don't want international intervention. I think this is something that we really have to take a look at very carefully. Why would we want to intervene in Nigeria? Okay, because I see all this hype going on. First of all, I want to make one very close, bring to one's attention, Amy Goodman, when she was on Democracy Now!, interviewing a former colleague of hers from Nigeria. He did point out that this group, Boko Haram, okay, which has carved out an area, and they are Islamic militants. Until 2009, there were no problems in Nigeria with this group, until the government had massacred many of their numbers. And now, and they've been having problems with this group ever since. And this is the group that is being credited for having committed these kidnappings. Another significant point is when I look up Nigeria, because I, like most Americans, didn't have a clue, wondered where are they located in Africa. They're known as the giant of Africa because they are large and have a very populous nation with a very large economy. They are expected to be one of the, by the World Bank, they are an emerging market. They are expected to be one of the BRICS in the, maybe not till 2050, but they are a very oil-rich nation, okay. And over the years, they were colonized by the British up until 1960 when they won their independence. And over the years, they've been vacillating between dictatorship and democracy. But they did have democratic elections in 2011, which were fairly peaceful. And this gentleman by the name of, Jonathan is his name. He is their leader, their president. And from what I understand, Africa's also, they have hegemony over West Africa, and in any event, and they have a very low ratio of debt to GDP. Now, I don't know if this is related to the railroads that China has offered to build in Africa. It may have absolutely nothing to do with it, just as I'm only speculating that the U.S. may have a reason to want to send troops into Africa. But I remember only a year or two ago, actually I think it was last year, we were talking about how the U.S. was sending in troops, JSOC I believe, into the Congo. And their reason at the time was to capture this Lords of, what was the name of the group?
Lord's Resistance Army.
Lord's Resistance Army by the name of Kony, that he was in in the Congo, which is not oil rich, but it's rich in natural resources. And when I talked to a former journalist from Uganda, he clearly specified that Uganda had already gotten rid of Kony. They had pretty much, got rid of him doing any of the atrocities. They were taking care of it themselves. And so that they looked at it as one of these, what they call white man's burden. We use this as an excuse to go in and take over land and property and control that. Somehow we have to be in control. We have to take care of it because the people can't do it themselves. And he clearly pointed out that the Ugandans had taken care of the Kony situation and that this was just a lot of hype as an excuse to go into the Congo. So I'm simply urging restraint. Excuse me. I can't talk anymore. Go on.
Thank you, Carol. We'll come back to that. I think you're on to a very important point there. The Nigerian situation is very much bound up with what U.S. policy in Africa is, and that's the context, as you suggest, it should be put into. We'll go now to Ron Zook, secrecy and deception.
This will be an extension in some respects of what I talked about last week concerning the war on truth and truth being the first casualty in a conflict, as we see emerging in not only in Africa but in Ukraine as well. I have a very near and dear friend who grew up was born in Moscow and grew up during the last days of the Soviet Union. And she reports that nobody there, or at least nobody in her circle, believed anything the government said. Instead, they were turning to the Voice of America and assuming they would get some kind of truth or enlightenment from there instead. That may be a little naive, I believe, with some other people, that all governments lie, and there's a lot of secrecy and deception going on everywhere. If anyone in our vast audience thinks they know of an exception to that, please let me know. That will be a marvelous thing if it's actually true. So the current fad, of course, is to call everyone that you're opposed to terrorist. It's used constantly now in American propaganda. Also, of course, Israeli propaganda. And of course, it's assumed that we are within our rights, certainly. Indeed, we have an obligation to eliminate all of those that we call terrorists. So when they kill a few of them, they will be sometimes, I suspect, retroactively branded as terrorist. And we've entered the stage now of daily body counts coming from Ukraine in the conflict there. Headline, fighting in eastern Ukraine kills 34, update. Ukrainian authorities said Tuesday that the situation along the country's border with Russia grew more unstable in the last week, with local pro-Russian residents attacking border guards or trying to intimidate them into changing allegiances. The Ukrainian government has pressed forward with a military offensive in the east to quell a pro-Russian insurgency, but Kiev is increasingly losing its grip in the eastern regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, which both border Russia. Meanwhile, Russia is claiming that it can't really control those people, the supposedly pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine. And here's another report in Harper's Weekly Review of what's going on there. I'll try to be brief. The interim government of Ukraine launched a military offensive against an estimated 800 pro-Russian separatists in the city of Slavyansk, one of the dozen eastern municipalities where militants have seized government buildings. 46 people died in the clash between pro-Kiev and pro-Moscow demonstrators in the port city of Odessa, and pro-Russian activists stormed Odessa's police headquarters and freed 67 detainees. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry demanded that the Russian government take action to defuse the crisis or risk broad sanctions against its financial and energy sectors again. And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov claimed Russia has lost its influence over the separatists. Quoting, "We again urge the Kiev organizers of terror," said a statement from Russia's foreign ministry, "to withdraw troops and to sit down finally at the negotiating table and start a normal dialogue. The process of dialogue had begun," said interim Ukrainian Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, only as it was drowned out by shots from Russian-made Kalashnikovs. Marchers carried signs reading, "Let's go to Crimea for a vacation," at the first May Day parade in Moscow's Red Square since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's looking more and more ominous there. There are a number of people who don't like to be called war hawks, actually, urging ever stronger action, whether it will include military action against Russia for their supposed role in this remains to be seen, but it's not looking good. Meanwhile, they are reporting that Russia is doing sinister things. Reuters report, U.S. says that Russian planes flew near California and Guam in upped activities. So the head of U.S. Air Forces in the Pacific said Monday that Russia's intervention in Ukraine had been accompanied by a significant increase in Russian air activity in the Asia-Pacific region in a show of strength and to gather intelligence. General Herbert Hawk Carlyle said the activity had included Russian flights to the coast of California and around the U.S. Pacific island of Guam. So I guess you know what that means. I don't, but anyway. Everybody is upping their activity, it seems, so up yours. U.S. U.S. signs new lease to keep strategic military installation in the Horn of Africa. So 10-year agreement with Djibouti, a small nation with less than 500,000 inhabitants on the Horn of Africa. And the U.S. drone strikes for all of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula are being operated out of there, apparently. If you look at the map, you'll see it's right at the bottom end of the southern tip of the Red Sea. It controls potentially all of the sea traffic from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. So another bad sign, I think. We're going to be there and building ever bigger installations for the next 10 years. The Djiboutis, I didn't even realize that was an independent country, actually. I just thought it was the name of the city, are being paid something like $70 million a year to let this happen. So on and on it goes, and I'm afraid we're talking ourselves into a very serious and extremely bad situation. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. We're saving our comments to the end. I can't avoid mentioning that the U.S. has just issued a Djibouti call in the fact that they've arranged a 20-year lease on this drone center that masquerades as a country. The U.S. has been rebuffed in its attempt to establish its African command in any African nation, even though it has militaries in most, it has U.S. military in most African nations, but now Djibouti is the center of it. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We will go next to Deb Johnson, circling the wagons around W. Right, Deb?
That's right. Last week I found myself in a doctor's office. It was a big room and there was a television at the other end of the room. And it looked like CNN was interviewing George W. Bush. I couldn't hear the interview at all, so I only have my imagination to think of what kind of fluff questions they were asking Mr. Bush. And in my mind, I thought, well, they're probably talking about his life on the ranch and the paintings that he's been working on, and how's his dog and his lovely wife. So I became enraged and felt sympathy at the same time for the American people and all of this propaganda that they are that they have to listen to on the television, making everything seem rosy and wonderful. And meanwhile, the world is trying to convict these people of war crimes. So instead of getting up and screaming at the television, war criminal, war criminal, war criminal, I decided to investigate what has been happening on the world front as far as trying to indict Mr. Bush and his administration. So basically, quickly, in 2005, the Association of Humanitarian Lawyers filed a petition at Organization of American States against the United States for attacks on hospitals and clinics in Fallujah. In September of 2005, German courts declared that Iraq war violated international law. And in 2006, Center of Constitutional Rights filed a war crimes complaint against Donald Rumsfeld in Germany. In 2007, Spanish judge called for the architects of the Iraq invasion to be tried for war crimes. And in 2011, in Kuala Lumpur, after 2 years of investigation by the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission, a tribunal consisting of 5 judges with judicial and academic backgrounds reached a unanimous verdict that found George W. Bush and Tony Blair guilty of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and genocide as a result of their roles in the Iraq War. Last week I spoke about a class action lawsuit, Sala versus Bush, which was filed in California, and we're still waiting for the result of that. For the first time ever in 2011, there was a conviction of guilty of Bush and his administration, the lawyers, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and all their legal advisors were found guilty of war crimes. And this is the first time that this has happened in the world. Basically, they heard testimonies from people, Abbas Abid, a 48-year-old engineer from Fallujah who had his fingernails removed. Ali Jaha was attacked with bare electrical wires and electrocuted and was hung from a wall. And one other gentleman, Mozam Beg, was beaten, hooded, and put in solitary confinement. So, you know, many mocked this trial and really saw that even though these people were found guilty of these crimes, that there was no way they were going to be handcuffed and taken off to jail. But what did come out of it was the president of the tribunal, Tan Sri Yuna Lamin, found that the prosecution had established beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused persons, former President Bush and his conspirators, engaged in a web of instructions, memos, directives, legal advice, and action that established a common plan and purpose, joint enterprise, and or conspiracy to commit the crimes of torture and war crimes, including and not limited to a common plan and purpose to commit the following crimes in relation to the war on terror and the wars launched by the U.S. and others in Afghanistan and Iraq. President Lamin told a packed courtroom, as a tribunal of conscience, the tribunal is fully aware that its verdict is merely declaratory in nature, The tribunal has no power or enforcement, no power to impose any custodial sentence on any one or more of the 8 convicted persons. What we can do under Article 31 of Chapter 6 of Part 2 of the Charter is to recommend that the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission to submit this finding of conviction by the tribunal together with a record of these proceedings to the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, as well as the United Nations and the Security Council. The tribunal also recommends to the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission that the names of all the 8 convicted persons be entered and included in the Commission's Register of War Criminals and be publicized accordingly. The tribunal recommends to the War Crimes Commission to give the widest international publicity to this conviction and grant of reparations, as these are universal crimes for which there is a responsibility upon nations to institute prosecutions if any of these accused persons may enter these jurisdictions. And I just want to remind people that in the world's eyes, W is a war criminal. And just recently, the Iraq Commission gathered in Brussels, Belgium, April 16th and 17th. And this is a conference that represents most of the most powerful and most current organized attempt in the world to bring justice to those responsible for the catastrophe in Iraq. And the goal for the conference was to begin to taking concrete steps towards international lawsuits that will bring former UK Prime Minister Blair and Bush, along with those responsible in their administrations, to justice for the myriad war crimes in Iraq. The tribunal is an international network of intellectuals, artists, and activists who denounce and organize against the logic of permanent war promoted by the U.S. government that is currently targeting the Middle East. We're here to condemn the original sin, the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, and how we can bring the perpetrators to court. And so they had this 2-day meeting, and basically they are continuing to come together and try to find concrete ways to move forward and to prosecute these people. So I commend them for that, and I look forward to hearing more about it. It was a wonderful article, by the way, that I got from Truth Out, written by Dahar Jamal. International lawyers seek justice for Iraqis. So I suggest that everyone read it because it was a wonderful article.
Thank you, Deb. Truth Out is an important resource. I quite agree. I think you're right about that. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Stuart Levy with some comments on some demonstrations, both here and in D.C., right, Stuart?
Well, actually, I have several sets of things, and one of them is directly connected with that. I'd mentioned here a couple of weeks ago a current effort by a Spanish judge, Pablo Ruiz, who is trying to pursue Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld for torture in a Spanish court under universal jurisdiction. And the Spanish government had recently passed something saying that the Spanish courts don't have the right to do it. There's a Roots Action petition calling on the Spanish government, thanking the Spanish people, and calling on the government to let the prosecution go forward. So this is happening today, right now. Another action item that I'd like to bring up comes through Just Foreign Policy. So there's a lawyer who was involved in writing the memos that the Obama administration used in justifying sending drones against U.S. citizens. And he is now he's currently nominated to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. So what this call, and this is from Just Foreign Policy, is asking us to call on our senators to not let this nomination go through until the Department of Justice releases the memos that which this man, Barron, has written that relate to drone strikes. You know, this is exactly the material that the Senate Oversight Committee should be able to see, and the Department of Justice has refused to give it up to them. This is a perfect time to do it. So call on our Senator Durbin to hold up the nomination of David Barron until the drone memos are released to the Senate. That's an action item. I have a couple of upcoming events that I think people might be interested in. There's two films being shown this week. One of them is about war and mass migration. It's called Twice a Stranger. It's being shown at 6 p.m. on Thursday the 8th. It's a documentary. They say the 20th century is often called the century of expulsions. From the collapse and breakup of multi-ethnic European empires after World War I to the creation of independent post-colonial states in the second half of the century, the nation building has been a violent process displacing millions of people. This is a cross-media project about the greatest forced migrations of the 20th century, from the Greek-Turkish exchange in the 1920s to the German-Polish forced immigration at the end of World War II, to the partition of India, and to the Cyprus crisis in the 1960s and 70s. So this is at 6 p.m. on Thursday the 8th in the Foreign Language Building, 707 South Matthews, in the Lucy Ellis Lounge. That's one. Another film being shown the following day is talking about prisons. It's called A Day at Stateville. Some of you might have seen this when it was performed live by prisoners at the Stateville prison in Illinois who came to, they'd been traveling around the state, they came and performed at the IMC. It's written by prisoners, it was being performed by ex-prisoners, it's been filmed, and the film is going to be shown at Channing Murray Foundation. And I assume there is going to be a discussion about prisons and prison reform afterward. So this film, A Day at Stateville, will be shown on Friday the 9th at 6:30 it's not at Channing Murray, but at the UU Church on Green Street, Unitarian Universalist Church, 309 West Green in Urbana. So with that, I'd like to put a question on the floor that came up at our demonstration this last weekend when we some young men passed by as we were standing there with our anti-war signs, and one asked, who would disagree with you? And I thought, and this seemed really very much akin to a question that we got from a woman a few months earlier who said, no one goes to war because they want to. And the implication of that is that we only go to war because we have to, which may be what this young man also thought. So I wanted to put that on the table. Why, if war is really a non-controversial subject, why do we have so much of it? And if it's really unwanted, well, I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much. Stuart, we'll come back to that, I think, in the last few minutes of the program. But before that, we have to make some recognition of an upcoming anti-war event, right, Karen?
That's right. That's right. In the
Another
past,
upcoming event.
in the past, I had mentioned that maybe a year ago, I had mentioned that Mother's Day was originally a peace thing, but actually, it's kind of not. I went and looked up the history, and okay. I will mention the Mother's Day Proclamation. The appeal to womanhood throughout the world, later known as the Mother's Day Proclamation by Julia Ward Howe, was an appeal for women to unite for peace in the world. It was written in 1870, and Howe's appeal to womanhood was a pacifist reaction to the carnage of the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. The appeal was tied to Howe's feminist conviction that women had a responsibility to shape their societies at the political level. In 1872, Howe asked for the celebration of a Mother's Day for Peace on the 2nd of June of every year, but she was unsuccessful. The modern Mother's Day in the United States is actually an unrelated celebration, and it was established by Anna Jarvis years later. But let's go back and continue to talk about the Mother's Day Proclamation. By how? Today the appeal is, okay, so I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from the appeal to womanhood throughout the world. Arise then, women of this day, arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands will not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, the women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each bearing after his own time the sacred impress not of Caesar but of God. In the name of womanhood and humanity, I earnestly ask that a general congress of women, without limit of nationality, may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient, and at the earliest period consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, and the great and general interests of peace.
Thank you, Karen.
That was wonderful.
We have a few minutes left for comments. I have one that I would like to throw in to start, and that is that I'm becoming increasingly concerned that the debate in Washington over war tactics is tending more and more towards war. And one of my reasons for feeling that way is an op-ed in the Washington Post this week from the awful Anne Marie Slaughter. Slaughter, well named as she may be, is an emerita professor at Princeton who was for 2 years under the Obama administration director of the policy planning in the U.S. State Department. She is, in other words, a Cold War liberal or a neoconservative, as the confused nomenclature of the American government has it. She has written an article. The article that I have in mind is was headlined in the Washington Post, Stopping Russia Starts in Syria. And the article from this liberal Princeton professor says nothing less than it's time to start killing people in Syria because that's the only way we'll deter the Russians from their invasion of Ukraine. Now, this is madness in 2 senses. First of all, it's a crazy account of what's happening. Secondly, it's madness in terms of the move towards war that is coming from our policy elites in this country. Peculiarly at the moment, we see that a debate within the Obama administration on these tactics, not over the strategy. The willingness of the Obama administration to use military force to establish economic control around the world is not in doubt. Its strategy is perfectly in accord with that of earlier administration. But tactics, whom to kill when, that is a matter of some debate within the Obama administration, and we find these wretched liberals like Anne Marie Slaughter pushing for more war, and in fact, I think Obama and the people right around him actually hesitating on that. Obama's comments the other day about the people who want to use military force should be paid attention to because he's talking about people in his own administration, in his own coalition. That leads me on to wonder, why is this happening now? Why are American policy elites pushing even beyond the president in wanting more war and using the occasion of the Ukraine crisis, which the Obama administration caused, in order to get its war on? And one dimension of this arises from the fact, if we think about a century of American wars, and there's been a lot of effort to draw parallels between the current situation in 2014 and the European situation in 1914 that led to the First World War, we see that the major power wars, including most notably those of the United States, over that last century, have often been prompted by social unrest. One of the main reasons the Democratic administration maneuvered the U.S. into World War I was a distraction from the demands for social reform, labor reform, that were rising in the United States. One of the main reasons a Democratic administration manipulated the U.S. into the Second World War was the rising view in the U.S. that the so-called Second New Deal was failing. And it certainly was the fact. The only thing that did overcome the Great Depression was not the New Deal, but war preparations. The same thing was repeated on a smaller scale in the post-war world. American elites were very much afraid that the end of the war would bring the Depression back, and eventually another war was arranged to prevent that economic downturn, that is, the war in Korea. So the tendency of a century of American government to use war and war scare to distract from social demands should concern us in the wake of the Great Recession that we are very much still in this country. Economic growth in the United States was practically flat, but was practically zero in the first quarter of this year. So I think there is a debate going on in Washington right now about how high they can turn the temperature on their war scare. And that's very dangerous for obvious reasons. When we have Ms. Slaughter calling for killing Syrians in order to deter Russians in the CIA's favorite newspaper, the Washington Post, we should be worried. Other comments now on things this evening. Karen?
Yeah, first I would like to comment on some of what Ron was talking about. I hope I'm not being repetitive here, but I would like to emphasize the fact that Noam Chomsky has just come out, and John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, as well as other intellectuals and commentators, in reference to what is happening in the Ukraine today with NATO troops on the border of Russia. This is as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis was. And I hope everyone in America understands how dangerous that was. That took place back in the 60s, and maybe people aren't getting that in their history books. So it really is, but it really is a very serious issue. Was I repeating some of what you said? I hope not. Okay. I have questions for Deb. I'd like her to, would you just please clarify for me? I miss things sometimes. Was the article by, is it Jahab Jamal in Truth Out? Is that, am I saying his name properly?
I think that's right, yeah.
Is that
Yes,
correct? Okay.
it's D-A-H-R,
Okay.
his first name, and then J-A-M-A-I-L.
Oh, Darjamal, yeah.
Yes.
A-I-L, okay. And was that in reference, that was in reference, the most recent one was in KL, Kuala Lumpur. Was that the most recent trial you were referring to?
Yeah. Well, the most recent thing that's happening was the Iraqi single mother filing a lawsuit in California.
That was in California.
Yeah, that was in California.
That was the most recent, okay.
Salah versus Bush.
Yeah,
Salah?
And that's last year, right? Sometime
In 2013.
Okay. And the one that they're urging that it go to the International, to ICC, the International Criminal Court, that was the one in KL, right?
Yes.
Okay. And Stuart, the one in the Spanish court currently, I guess I'm just bringing up a question. Would it be possible if all of these trials were to get together and urge going to the International Criminal Court, which has legitimacy, would that be of any benefit Does anyone here see that happening?
One
The
problem with that.
USA does not recognize
Exactly.
the International Criminal Court. It's one of the few.
Except for
Right.
other people.
Oh, I
Yeah,
know.
right.
Right. Oh, I know they don't. I know they don't. But the rest of the world,
The U.S. explicitly accepted itself from the jurisdiction.
oh, I know that, I know. But it would have, I mean, I think that the urging, at whatever, whatever the findings are of these trials, I would hope that then they would push it to the ICC to take it on. It may not have, I know it doesn't have legitimacy with the U.S. I'm very well aware of that, having spent a lot of time on what took place in Cambodia. But I'm very interested in, like for many of us who would like to see something truly legitimate, even if it has no teeth or no power, but some of these trials and their outcomes then being perhaps, pursued in absenteeism, in absentia within the International Criminal Court.
All right. So to answer your question
Please, yeah.
maybe more directly, the International Criminal Court complaint filed against Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Tenet, Rice, and Gonzalez, and the international arrest warrants requested were made from Champaign, Illinois, in the United States. Just so you know.
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
When?
Oh
That
yeah.
must mean Francis Boyle?
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
2010, January 20th, 2010. And his letter starts off, and I'll just start his letter.
Okay.
Please accept my personal compliments. This is to the International Criminal Court judge. I have the honor hereby to file with you and the International Criminal Court this complaint against U.S. citizens George W. Bush, Richard Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, George Tenet, Condoleezza Rice, and Alberto Gonzalez, hereinafter referred to as the accused, for their criminal policy and practice of extraordinary rendition. This term is really a euphemism for the enforced disappearances of persons, their torture, severe deprivation of their liberty, their violent sexual abuse, and other inhumane acts perpetuated upon these victims. The accused have inflicted this criminal policy and practice of extraordinary rendition upon about 100 human beings, almost all of whom are Muslims, Arabs, Asians, and people of color. I doubt very seriously that the accused would have inflicted these criminal practices upon 100 white Judeo-Christian men. The accused criminal policy and practice of extraordinary rendition are both widespread and systematic within the meaning of Rome Statute Article 7.1. Therefore, the accused have committed numerous crimes against humanity in flagrant and repeated and long-standing violation of Rome Statute Articles 5.1b, 7.1a, and it goes on for a while. Furthermore, the accused Rome Statute crimes against humanity of enforced disappearances of persons constitutes ongoing criminal activity that continues even as of today. The United States is not a contracting party to the Rome Statute, because we kind of bow out of anything that of any importance that would actually interfere with our, anyway, that's my comment. Nevertheless, the accused ordered and were responsible for the commission of these ICC statutory crimes on, in, and over the respective territories of several ICC member states, including many located in Europe. Therefore, the ICC has jurisdiction over the accused for their ICC statutory crimes in accordance with Rome Statute Articles 12.2a, which provides as follows, and then it goes on. And so basically it has been filed, continues to be
Where would I find this
Yes,
document? Where would I
keep
find
it
this
short.
document?
I can send it to you. It's
Okay.
part of the, actually it's the,
Can it be Googled? I mean,
yeah, in fact, the way I got to it was law professor, it's actually at the IMC, the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center. There's an article in there. So it's the IMC's webpage, but if you just Google law professor at UFI, Bush International
Okay.
Criminal Court.
Okay.
it'll come up with
Well,
it.
actually, there was some of that in this article from the Foreign Policy Journal that basically got into the trial that happened in Malaysia.
Yeah.
And there, I didn't mention this, but it says here the U.S. is subject to customary international law and to the principles of the Nuremberg Charter, said Boyle, who also believes the week-long trial was almost certainly being monitored by the Pentagon and the White House.
Sure.
But he referenced the Nuremberg Charter, which was used as a format for the tribunal, when asked about the credibility of the initiative in Malaysia. And he said leaders, organizers, instigators, and accomplices participating in the formulation of execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit war crimes are responsible for all acts performed by any person in execution of such a plan. So basically, you know, if you reference the Nuremberg Charter, I mean, it's pretty valid as far as the crimes that were committed.
Oh, right. Oh, there's, yeah.
I'm just
But-
going to mention one more thing. We saw this movie, The Unknown Known, which is about Rumsfeld, and it's just a brutal.
It's an extremely chilling interview.
Yes, with Rumsfeld, and it's a documentary, and it's just Rumsfeld talking. And the only statement that actually is in there that is actually true by Rumsfeld is that Obama said that he was against all these things but continues the policies. And so that's the only thing that was actually,
Right.
everything else that Rumsfeld said in the movie is, it's really amazing because the documentary is just Rumsfeld talking, and there's only like one or two other things, and the narrator. So it's not interviews back and forth, it's just Rumsfeld contradicting himself constantly. Like he'll say, I never said that we should torture people, and then the next thing, well, we should be torturing people. It's just back, and we never assassinate leaders of other countries. Well, we went in to
course we
assassinate
did.
the leader instead of starting a war.
Yeah.
And it's just it's just Rumsfeld contradicting himself all over the place. But
So how did this movie come to fruition? I mean, who supported this movie? Who paid for this movie? Do you have any idea?
Probably Rumsfeld.
Probably Rumsfeld.
It's a participant.net thing. It was made by Errol Morris, who also made a movie which I would love to see called The Fog of War.
Yes.
That interviews McNamara,
Oh,
who was involved
I've
in the
seen
Vietnam
that.
War. And
Yeah.
Ron Kester, who saw this one, who's seen both of them and watched The Unknown Known with us last night, compared the point of view of McNamara, who looked back with horror on his actions during the Vietnam War, with Rumsfeld, who is, I mean, he acts as a perfect technocrat. He's completely isolated from any consequences, physical or moral, of his actions. You know, what happens, happens. This is the kind of thing that he says over and over again. Something else that he's quoted as saying in a memo from decades ago, at a time when I think he was the U.S. Middle East envoy under Reagan, was, you know, peace does not last. The only things that last are conflict, blackmail, and killing. And this is the man who has been in substantial charge of U.S. foreign policy over the span from Nixon to Bush, and he fit in nicely, I'm sure, with the existing framework.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it mirrors exactly what's happening now.
You know, I would
Foreign
take
policy now.
I would take issue with our friend Ron's comment about Earl Morris's earlier movie on McNamara as well. I think it's a problem sometimes with the form of retrospect of American politics we get to demonize individuals for very real crimes that they carried out, and not to recognize the continuity of the policy that produces those crimes. For example, the contrast with McNamara is not, I think, so great as Ron suggests. I've seen Errol Morris's movie on McNamara as well, and the regret that McNamara expresses that movie is his regret for not realizing earlier that in spite of carpet bombing, the war in Vietnam couldn't be won, and for making a wrong management decision about it. That is to say, you know, it's sort of, remember, he was a Ford Motor Company executive. He's sort of like talking as if it was a mistake to market the Edsel.
Got it.
This panel is old enough to remember
Got
that.
it,
But my
yeah.
point is that it's not the sort of regret that we might expect from a mass murderer that he carried out mass murder. It's a regret that he did it inefficiently, you know, and that it was unnecessary and so forth. The contrast, in other words, with Rumsfeld is far less than we would think.
Or we would like.
Let me make clear you're talking about a different Ron.
Yes.
It's R-O-H-N. It's not me.
No,
Yes,
and
another
Ron is
different Ron, not our Ron.
a welcome member of AWARE, and we're happy to have him. So I was just talking about his the characterization of Morris's
Yes.
two movies.
Yes, and I think that's what we also need to take into account is that the other Ron, as well as you, but the other Ron is definitely more than charitable in wanting to see humanity in any person.
Of course.
And that's also what the average person would like to do, is see humanity in a person. And so that's probably why we misinterpret, regret. And really, we need to carefully look at what they're really saying.
Yeah.
When they're making foreign policy, when they're doing press releases, when they're getting up in front of people and saying things, we cannot assume that they are expressing humanity in any stance. Even when they're saying, let's go invade, because for humanitarian reasons, we have to look at the real reason and assume that they're lying about the humanitarian reason.
Well, perhaps we
doesn't
need to
this-
push that little poem that you read today on Mother's Day.
Yeah.
Maybe that should be our new Pledge of Allegiance, and maybe we should send it to Congress and ask them to recite this every day before they begin their work, because I think they've totally lost control of what really is important, and that's humanity.
Well, doesn't this get back to Hannah Arendt? I remember us discussing some of what she had been saying. I can't quote it right now, but it was similar in that, when we look for humanity, we expect a monster. When we see the inhumane things that man does, we are expecting to see a monster. And then we look and we realize that they're actually a human being. But anyway, I won't go on from there.
But the movie really did remind me of Hannah Arendt and of Eichmann, I think, whose trial she covered. And what shocked her and what she shocked the people around her by reporting was not that Eichmann was some sort of grotesque monster, but that he seemed like an ordinary, officious character who was fitting into the bureaucracy around him.
Hence the
And that's-
banality of evil.
That's the
Yeah,
word I was looking
exactly.
for. Thank you.
Trying to advance his career.
You've been watching AWARE on the Air, presented by
Banality.
members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 19th week of 2014. Thanks to Jason Liggett and Yosef Kosh for direction and production, thanks to whom also this program will be available, like others, on YouTube. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zote, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Deb Johnson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.